All right.
All right, so I'll get my screen share going. And let's see. Okay, can everyone see that okay?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Alice, and I recently got my MA from NYU, and I'll be starting a PhD program at Syracuse University, so not far from Eunice right now. And I just want to say thank you to the New York State Political Science Association and to Tony Spinakos, the chair of the Comparative Politics, and Eunice for the opportunity to present today. All right, I'll be presenting on networks and belonging, co-national social capital, and US refugee integration. Some key terms to go over before jumping into things is co-national, meaning individuals from the same country. So an example of that would be 2 or more Korean immigrants within the US can be referred to as co-nationals. Social capital, and this definition is taken from Lynn, assets embedded within a network. And then the combination of those two terms is co-national social capital, meaning assets embedded within an immigrant's co-national network. And then finally, secondary migration refers to immigrant relocation from an initial resettlement location to a location in a different territory within a country. So for example, today I'd be looking at secondary migration, meaning a migration from one US state to another. For refugees in the US, this is particularly important because it means foregoing government assistance in the process. And so the frame of this question, or the basic research question, is do co-nationals support the integration process for refugees, and how? The frame of it is that existing refugee movement is relatively high, much higher than the immigrant population, rest of the immigrant population in the United States. 17% of refugees in the US opt for in-country secondary migration, again, meaning that they forego government assistance in the process most of the time. And that correlates with 2 factors. So a destination's low unemployment rate and an existing co-national network. Another important point to think about is the objectives of the US refugee resettlement system. So there's 2 goals, and one is to achieve refugee integration and self-sufficiency, and the other is to balance host community preferences. And then the kind of almost moral question of related to this research question is about restricted movement in the US. So currently the US refugee resettlement system pretty openly encourages refugees to remain in their assigned locations, and government assistance rarely follows refugees after secondary migration. So there's a question of whether or not this is justified, especially thinking about how refugees are populations that have gone through a lot of restrictions and a lot of like, for lack of a better word, oppression. And so the question mark then is whether or not they should have continued restricted movement. So key concepts within this, or to answer this question of how refugee co-nationals assist or don't assist refugee integration, I actually, I'm looking at it through a social capital lens. So key concepts then are kind of the uniqueness of social capital. Social capital works in instrumental and expressive actions not accounted for by other forms. This is largely due to the fact that resources are only available through a network, and the network is fluid, but it's also limited. And that brings us to the first important principle of many important principles in social capital, but 2 that we're looking at that I'm looking at with this research question is quality in networks. So quality refugee social networks correlate with higher employment rates, while low quality networks correlate with greater competition and lower employment rate. The way you can think about quality in networks is kind of the opportunities that already exist in the network are the only opportunities that you can access through that network. So if you don't have access to an opportunity via a network, you're not going to be able to really use it or capitalize on it. The second principle of social capital that's worth looking at is the quantity in the networks. So the quantity of actors in a network reinforces quality, and that kind of ties in with this idea of low quality networks. While they can bring many things, if a network doesn't have a lot of economic opportunities and there are a lot, say employment opportunities, and there are a lot of other actors in it, then that actually increases competition rather than increasing resources for the network. And then finally, integration scores. So integration, how well are refugees integrated in US society in this case? And these scores were calculated for economic, linguistic, and navigational integration using a method from Harder et al. And the Stanford Immigration Policy Lab. So using a social capital theory framework and thinking about integration, I'm using this equation: integration equals the interactive term between co-national population size and in a state and state unemployment rate or state employment rate. So there's an effectively random assignment of refugee resettlement locations in the US as well. There's plenty of background on that, but to some extent, it kind of provides for a quasi-natural experiment. And I used the ACS American Community Survey data from 2017. And so thinking back to the migration rate of refugees, which is 17%, which is pretty significant and pretty high, the idea is that they're being drawn to areas or states with high employment rates. So the question here is whether the pull factors that refugees are migrating toward are benefiting them integration-wise. So we should hope to see kind of results in this green square, meaning that high employment rate and greater co-national population are associated with greater integration scores. Where there's room to be concerned with secondary migration behavior among US refugees is if we see results in this red square, which is that high unemployment rate is associated with lower integration scores. And I found a handful of findings, but I think the most important for today's is that in economic integration, overall, the relationship between refugee integration and employment rate is positive at higher rates of co-national share, and then not so for lower rates of co-national share. And apologies if anyone can't see this very well, but the blue line is the upwardly sloped line, and that also represents the higher co-national rate, co-national population share. And so the state employment rate and integration are positively correlated at high population share, which kind of justifies to some extent refugee secondary migration patterns. And then you don't see that as the case for the lower population share, which is the red line and sloped down. The second finding is linguistic integration, which is notably not economic integration. And so higher rates of co-national share for refugee integration and employment rate is a neutral relationship. And this actually goes against kind of the social capital theory expectations, where you can imagine if you're going to a state with a high co-national population share, say of a Spanish-speaking country or a country speaking not English, that you might expect that folks can kind of exist within a community that mostly does not speak English. And this second graph, so on the right, shows the same equation, but for the immigrant population in the US. And it finds that at higher co-national populations, you see that expectation where there are lower English integration scores or linguistic integration scores. And then on the left is refugee integration, where it's basically, there's really no statistical significance difference between higher populations and lower populations. And so refugees are are not necessarily in a linguistic integration disadvantage if they're among higher population, higher co-national shares. And then the third finding kind of piggybacks off of both the economic and non-economic integration types, which is that refugee integration and non-refugee integration in the US have very different relationships apparently with co-national social capital. And you can see that this is just both of the graphs for economic integration for both refugee data and non-refugee data. And you can see that the lines are actually, or the relationship between the population shares the relationship between state employment rate and integration are almost opposite at different integration or different co-national shares. So for instance, higher co-national shares and higher state employment correlate to greater rates of integration for refugees, and the opposite is true for non-refugee immigrants in the US. So conclusions based on this is that, first of all, but maybe not exactly addressing the original question of do co-national populations assist refugee integration, a key conclusion is that there are differences. So overall, co-national social capital affects refugee integration differently than it affects that of non-refugee immigrants. And then a second conclusion is that positive relationships exist. So generally, greater co-national population and employment rate correlates with higher economic and linguistic integration outcomes for refugees. I didn't find that this was a case for non-refugee immigrants, but I think that the real conclusion here has to do with refugees, especially considering their secondary migration patterns. And then lastly, and this relates to existing US refugee resettlement policy, there's evidence to support refugee agency. And I think ultimately kind of an argument here for the US to potentially rethink its policy of encouraging refugees to stay, because secondary migrating refugees appear to be executing an effective and theoretically justified, at least through social capital theory, solution to integration and self-sufficiency, which if we think back to the goals of the refugee resettlement system, they seem to be finding their own solutions that fit the very goals of the refugee resettlement system. And that's all I have for today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It was perfectly timed. The second paper is the state's power duty in ensuring effectiveness and celerity in adopting children with prospective genitors under closed regime. So you have also 15 minutes. Humberto, you are muted.
Now it's okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get here from the beginning. All right, you can hear me well? We can, okay. So this is the paper we intend to present now. The state's power duty in ensuring effectiveness and celerity in adopting children with prospective genitors under closed regime, the prevalence of the best interests of the child, and the full protection of children. This is a special paper prepared for this New York Social Politics Annual Conference, written by Humberto Oliveira, Diogo Santos, and Lucas Ferreira. Yeah? We are from the Federal University of Maranhão, Department of Law, and graduate student Lucas Diego Oliveira. The most important outline point here are research objectives, questions and hypotheses, Brazilian prison system, criminal execution and child protection, the rights of children with imprisoned parents or guardians, the adoption of children of imprisoned parents or guardians and the duties of the Brazilian state, and a final discussion. The research objectives, the main research objectives of this paper, questions and hypotheses. Objective is we aim to investigate the perishable nature of the child in a condition of prison in inferiority imposed by the conditions of his parents. And according to what we have researched so far, the most important hypothesis here, we divided into two main groups. The state has a duty towards children to ensure the conditions for their full development with dignity, notwithstanding their parents' imprisonment, under the principles of child development and fundamental rights and guarantees of children's protection. And as a second most important point, adoption of children of imprisoned parents or guardians is an effective mechanism to ensure children's conditions and environment for their full psychological, physical, and social development under the Brazilian constitutional system. And according to the topics we developed here, we talked about the Brazilian prison system, criminal execution, and child protection. First part. I tried to mention this first point here. The prison system in Brazil, among numerous social issues with extensive relevance, is one of the most complex factors in the Brazilian social reality. Even though the maturity of the science of law can be recognized, the need to respect human rights, the physical integrity and the moral of the individual, there is still a little need for the improvement of public policies. So we decided to make some special points here according to the first part of the paper. So the prison system in Brazil versus human rights. Although we have mentioned before that human rights now tend to be more observed, but there is still a lack of respect and observation according to the prison system in Brazil, especially in case of women under this kind of regime in Brazil. So the protection of the unborn child or infant in the prison system is one of the most polemical things according to the aspects of resocialization and according to the minimum and maximum time the child has to be in prison, especially when the mother is breastfeeding the baby. So the prison system and resocialization is a very delicate point here according to the time the mother or father will be released back to society. The power of the state to guarantee the dignity of those in prison, according to the Brazilian the Brazilian Penal Execution Law, we call LEP in Brazil, the minimum conditions that law of executions establishes, and according to the international mechanisms and institutions also have to demand some protection. The incarceration of the prisoner and the very serious damages that this causes to the family circle, not only the child, not only the father and the mother, but the whole family suffers these very serious consequences. Separation and establishing a new family for this child, or also the period of time this child has to be living with a step family, etc. The second part of the Brazilian prison system, we detached some important points here. The right of the unborn child with the penitentiary system and the rights of the infant, especially those who have incarcerated parents. So this is something very typical when children start growing up a little bit and they have to be separated from the parents, especially the mother. Children born within the prison system and the consequent and later psychological traumas, of course, as I mentioned before, the short lifespan with the mother and the abrupt separation. It's very, very important that this has psychological aspects to be studied. Child and Adolescent Statute, that we call ECA in Brazil, and the comprehensive protection and responsibilities of family, society, and the state guaranteeing rights for the children and adolescents. Some of the most important aspects have to be considered here because this statute shows and establishes some minimum measures for the different kinds of protection according to education, leisure, and other aspects have to be taken into consideration. And according to the statute, to the Child and Adolescent Statute, we have the adoption as an exceptional measure and irrevocable act. So this is very important when considering that children have to be separated from the parents, especially the mother, whose interests have to be respected and considered, and adoption by a different member, a different person, not family members, but different people used by the Adoption Institute, is one of the most serious measures and consequences of the process. The rights of children with imprisoned parents or guardians, we took into consideration the Brazilian Constitution. According to the Article 207, children have the right to family and community coexistence. This is something that should be taken into consideration when relevant aspects as consequences should be measured and the best interests of the child. The Brazilian Statute of Child and Adolescent established that every child or adolescent has the right to be raised and educated within his or her own family, and exception in a substitute family, ensuring family and community coexistence. This is according to the Article 19 from the ECA, the Child and Adolescent Statute in Brazil. So, as we mentioned before, this is a very exceptional measure to be taken when we talk about substitute family, because, as we mentioned, is something that we cannot go back in terms of decision. Once the child goes or is adopted by a different family, it's very, very difficult turning back and trying to take this child or adolescent back to this original family. So this is one of the most important aspects to be taken into consideration. But although we mentioned that the family, the original family, has a very important paper in developing the child or adolescent, it's in growing this child or adolescent, it's very, very difficult that parents have the right to be living with this child or adolescent, because sometimes the lack of time that they have to spend together is something that we should observe. And adoption as this exceptional measure, we have to mention some important aspects. When it's necessary, when there is a need for adoption, it is the sole form allowed under Brazilian law for another adult, who is not the original parent or guardian, to hold rights and duties towards the child to exercise parental care and protection. And, as well as children, are frequently neglected and or abandoned by their immediate family, and their parents or the guardian are imprisoned. So this is something that has to be taken into consideration when we have to use a substitute family or a definitive family for this child or infant. Some mechanisms of protection for children and adolescents are established by the ECA, the Child and Adolescent Statute in Brazil. But although this is something to be observed, the bureaucracy is still an obstacle for adoption. According to this graphic here, we see that only 17% of the children are available for adoption. 83% are still in process and are not ready to be adopted by substitute or definite family. So this is something that is very serious in Brazil. And according to this, also to these statistics, the age of the child or adolescent is still a problem in Brazil, because according to the Brazilian National Council of Justice, there is a preference for children and infants from 0 to 3 years old. So the adoption of children and imprisoned parents and guardians in duties of Brazilian state. Second part, children of incarcerated parents, of course, have a more expressive delay in terms of adoption. It's not easy because all the process takes some time, and the precariousness of the system and time the child can live with his or her mother is still a problem, as we mentioned in the beginning of this presentation. The breastfeeding time is maximum to 6 months, and it's still a problem when we talk about adoption. The situation of social vulnerability of the parents and the high rejection rate of families, as we mentioned before, families, most of the times, they refuse or neglect these children or adolescents taken by family members. And of course, as a very serious consequence, there is a very important violation of the principle of the best interest of the child, of course, especially when we talk about these interests in terms of infants and adolescents. And as one of the most precarious ways of the system is the overloaded judiciary system in Brazil, and a balance between the protection of children and a more efficient process. It's something that has to be worked according to the time, according to the interest of the judiciary system. That is sometimes a very, very soft point that has to be considered. And as conclusions of this work, we mentioned that the vulnerability of the children of incarcerated parents have a longer time to be adopted. The system doesn't help so much in terms of possibilities of different kinds of adoption. There is also some time needed for the child and adolescent period that has to be respected according to the Brazilian legislation. And this is sometimes the time that has to be taken by the families so that they can have this adopted child or adolescent with these genitors in prison. And as touchstone here that has to be observed is that the best interest of the child is not taken into consideration in many of these adoption process. We have some main references on this paper, and this is something that has to be studied a little bit more. And of course, to enhance this paper, we still have some projects going on according to this main object of this paper. And we'd like to thank you for your attention and special interest.
Okay, thank you very much. So maybe you want to unshare the screen.
Okay.
So, but I mean, I can talk like that too. It's not it's not a big deal. So thank you very much first of all, for these very extremely clear presentations. I will make a few comments on each paper. I read them both. And then if you have any comments on the papers, other paper presented, you can of course go ahead and do that. And also you can have another like 5 minutes each to respond to papers or make extra comments that that you have not included in the presentation if you want. So first I will start with Alice's paper. I thought that that was an exceedingly interesting and very well devised project. I read it with great interest. I feel like this was a larger than a paper, more like a thesis type of project, but it was very well devised. My main comment actually is not really a criticism, but a suggestion, is a rather large one. And I would not expect this to be integrated, obviously, in the paper as it is. It's a standalone paper right now. It's a standalone project right now. But it feels like this project would benefit a lot, a great deal from a qualitative component. As you know, your causal mechanisms working through social capital would be clarified with a qualitative component, with in-depth study, with interviews or other mechanisms, so that they would clarify your causal mechanisms quite a bit, I would say, and make them more convincing. And also, such a qualitative component would increase our confidence in the interpretation of some of the results that are somehow unexpected, I would say. Like you say unexpected, so I will repeat it. So unexpected and somehow not a little ambiguous, like some of those interpretations of your own results, you are also not very confident because, you know, there is no empirical data backing those. So like the one that is on page 23 of the paper, refugee economic integration, you observe to correlate positively with state employment rate at higher levels of co-national proportion and negatively at lower levels of co-national proportions. Figure 1, you know, that figure that you showed also. So in close alignment with the previous discussion of social capital theory. So that part is fitting with the social capital theory, which is your basic theoretical framework that you drive your causal mechanisms. Co-national networks can therefore be understood, you write, as primary resource networks for refugees who act as in-network agents and benefit from in-network resources. In contrast, regression models for the all immigrant and non-refugee samples reveal the opposite. Right? The negative effects of state employment rate at higher levels of co-national proportions and positive or neutral effects at lower co-national proportions. So this is your findings. You also presented it. And then you explain a little bit that at the conclusion, but that explanation is actually very interesting. And it would be pursued more convincingly, I would say, with a qualitative study, given the limitations of the data that you have. So that's the limitations of data that we all have, right? It's not your data's fault. It's generally is not available. So that's my general comment. It's not really a criticism because I'm aware that this is a project. You cannot have everything in a single project. But also, like, I would like to ask this co-national, the word co-national proportion and the measure co-national proportion. Do you think it would be useful to also measure, in addition to this co-national proportion, co-linguistic or cultural civilizational communities? Like a larger community than nation state origin. So it would maybe it would require you to cluster countries of origins in larger groups. I can imagine South Asian Muslim communities from Bangladesh, Pakistan, and other, like maybe in India, Muslim population, immigrants from India or refugees from India. So all of those could be, although they are not from the same nation country, they are forming probably communities, right? And they may be those social capital links with integration would work equally well, maybe something like that. So first I should ask, like, what is that connational measure that you are using? What does it mean exactly? But also if it only means country of origin, then would it be possible to combine it in a larger measure of civilizational, cultural communities, especially countries with the same language, right? All South American countries, all Central American countries, with the exception of Brazil and Haiti, maybe, it can be considered as cultural community, right? They may be communicating well with each other and form communities with social capital networks, right? And same for Arabics, other Middle Eastern communities, etc., right? Arabic-speaking countries and other Middle Eastern communities, maybe. So this is all I would point out, those issues. If you allow me, I would like to speak also, like, say a couple of things about the second paper, and then we can all discuss a little bit further. This is also a very interesting paper, and I learned a lot about the subject matter. I didn't know much. I don't have. I don't think I have very strong comments, good comments on the paper, because of the subject matter is different, and it's also a little bit more law paper than political science paper. But the discussion, this discussion of the legal system and rules and the prison system, and coming up with very reasonable, actually this paper I think comes up with very reasonable conclusions on that, on the adoption, children in incarceration issues. So it's very reasonable. The paper reads as a very reasonable paper that is convincing to an audience, at least like me, who doesn't know the subject matter very well. But I would like to ask two questions, whether or not it will be possible to integrate both of those, about integration of different literatures into the paper. First, do you think it would be fitting to discuss moral ethical aspects of the issue via social and political theory? Because you do not refer to social and political theory, your paper is more about legal system and legal rules, and their and reasonable conclusions about what is right, what is wrong in terms of what's happening in society. But those discussions may be buttressed, I thought, by a discussion of moral, ethical and political theory. There are, I would say that there are some resources that could be used on that issue. Also, another literature is that sociological or social scientific features of parts of the arguments could perhaps be integrated into the paper a little bit more empirically. Like, there are empirical social scientific studies, I presume, although I don't know, I'm not knowledgeable on those issues, but I presume that there are social scientific studies that would provide empirical support to different components of your paper. For example, empirical support, we are talking about psychological traumas of the children born in prison, etc. There are a number of studies, social psychology studies, sociology studies on those issues. So maybe data from those, in particular for Brazil, but in general, comparative data on those relationships could be maybe integrated, and it would maybe strengthen the paper if they are. So those two are my comments, although of course with a with hesitation, because I'm not the expert in any sense of the word on those issues. So those are my comments. If you would like to comment on each other's papers, of course, feel free to do so. If you want to respond to these, you can, of course, do so too. So maybe we should start with Alice with the same order, right?
Sure. Well, first of all, Eunice, thank you so much for the feedback. I think it's super helpful. And I'm going to do my best to incorporate what you mentioned. Just to think about the co-national population or respond to that feedback. Co-national population was emphasized by a handful of papers out of Stanford's Immigration Policy Lab. So I kind of just went with that because they had found evidence and they had used that variable. I think there's something to be said about people coming from the same state and having ties in a very unique way that maybe cross-national kind of collections or regional collections may not. At the same time, I think that that is a very, like, it's very intriguing to me, and I would like to incorporate that co-linguistic and or kind of co-cultural connection, because I think there may be kind of an there's an emphasis on co-national populations in those studies that I've been curious about as well, and wondering if that was kind of either chosen because it was one of the first variables, or chosen really strategically. So I'm gonna ask myself the same question that you asked me, and on the next version. And then I had one question to follow up your feedback around how the paper seems like a little bit more of a thesis. I mean, it's really born out of my master's thesis, so that's kind of why it would maybe feel bigger. But I was wondering if there were logical kind of dividing points that you saw when you read it and thought, okay, this part could be a paper versus this part could be a separate paper. Because I would just want to know anyone's thoughts really on that. Thank you.
I will just say then one thing, like it is, I mean, it is a very good work, but the motivation part, and the US refugee resettlement system parts could be a little tighter, I would say, or shorter, not tighter, or shorter, and tighter, and instead of motivation, maybe another subtitle would be better, but you know, it's a matter of preference. Also that would also make the paper more in line with the word count limitations. As it is I think closer to 10,000 words, maybe 9, 10. So if it's most journals are around 8, 9. So maybe a little bit of tightening of the first parts would also have additional benefits. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Jonas. Maybe we would like to thank you for your considerations, for your observations and feedback. And of course, we can measure some of the very important aspects that you mentioned. And I'd like to read something very interesting here, according to our work, is that in relation to the availability of the minor child of prisoners' parents for adoption, this should occur only after the effective removal of family power with the fulfillment of all phases of the procedure provided in the Article 155 of the following law. That's the child and adolescent legislation in Brazil. Yeah, and according to some of the United Nations Development Program, Brazil does not obey or does not fulfill all the requirements for this prison system, and especially women who have children, who have babies in prison. And some reports show that we still have a long way to go to try to follow the right procedures when you talk about separating mother and children and the adoption process. But your observations were very, very welcome. Maybe Diogo has something to say.
Diogo or me? You said you or Diogo? I'm sorry.
I said, I don't know if Diogo has something to say, also to complement. Oh yeah, okay.
So you are in the same room, I think. So
yes.
All right. Now I figured it out. All right. No, I'm.
Oh, okay. It's because Umberto and I are sharing the same room, but we are separate computers. So if we turn on the microphones at the same time, it turns out a big speaker mess. But thank you very much, Yunus, for your right on point comments on our research. And those are points that we see ourselves. This is our undergraduate student research that he kindly requested us to present on the conference. And he was a little bit shy to present it himself, even though we encouraged him to do so. And we are pretty sure that he would be capable of. But yes, those points of both the ethical and social objective or social public policy points, that what is adoption for and what would be the social benefits. This is the next steps that we are taking in the research, and also incorporated in statistical data, both in the domestic and comparative perspectives. That is for sure. We are to do that. Thank you very much, because that's going to reinforce our position into putting the students to go to work and incorporate them. But I grew very curious of Alice's research, because a while ago we developed here in our university some research on Venezuelan refugees in the northern extreme of Brazil, in the Brazilian border with Venezuela. There is right now a movement of refugees from Venezuela into Brazil. And your comment, Yunus, is right on point as well regarding common culture and common language. Although Brazil does not speak the same language of the rest of most of Latin America, of course, but the languages are somewhat intelligible, and but one of the funny things that happens there is that although Brazilians tend to understand Spanish, Spanish speakers do not tend to understand Portuguese unless they study or they grow very, very accustomed to it. And that has created some tensions in the border, especially in the area. So that you have an idea, the state that has been receiving, that is the entry point of most Venezuelan refugees into Brazil, has only 600,000 inhabitants as a regional population. That is less than half of the population of the city that we live here. It's kind of like Sacramento, half of Sacramento, California. And this is the whole state. And that state has received the same population in 1 year as of refugees. So one of the problems, Alice, is that in Brazil we're facing is not so much to integrate them culturally or socially, but actually allocating those people in the country, because we need to redistribute them geographically. And I imagine that there is a problem as well in some other countries. I imagine that in Turkey that happens as well. There is a tension into reallocating those people from the refugee camps into. So I don't know if I could ask for Alice's thoughts on that. But it would. I'm pretty sure that it's a curiosity of mine. What's your take on that?
Well, first of all, thanks for taking an interest. I know sometimes at conferences it's hard to follow along even in the 10-minute segments. I think it brings up a really interesting point. That's obviously, like, in terms of the refugee kind of global eyes are on Venezuelan refugees, as well as a handful of other large populations. I think with respect to what I'm looking at with this paper, it's hard to contextualize just because the refugee population in the U.S. is significantly smaller, and so I think it's somewhat less visible, and there's a real divide between the way people see refugees versus the way people see immigrants in general, which might not be the case with such a big influx. I think, well, one paper I did enjoy writing and researching that wasn't this, though I did enjoy this one too, but was on Nordic refugees in Sweden during World War II. So it was a time of a lot of chaos and large refugee influxes, and Swedish people didn't necessarily love Norwegians or Norwegian refugees at the time, but there was a big influx, and they found somehow some agency and a lot of what ended up being pretty good relations. And then Sweden ended up for decades afterwards becoming kind of the leader in refugee rights and refugee inclusion in kind of, or at least in the Western world. So I think if Brazil wanted a good, if Brazil had the political inclination to want to have good refugee integration, that maybe they would look at that. But I think a lot has changed since the 1940s as well. So there's so much on how borders are just a lot more militarized and things. So with that in mind, I'm not sure I can speak much more to the Brazilian, Venezuelan stuff, but that's my first thought. And I appreciate that you asked me that question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. Very, very helpful.
Thank you very much to everybody. I think this was a success because this is the first time I'm doing something like this. I'm sure you are also in a panel pre-recorded is different than usual, that what we are accustomed to. So thank you very much for your flexibility and your excellent presentations. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Have a nice afternoon.
You too. You too.